science of consciousness by tracing back to the ancient wisdom of Keshe. This lecture, this presentation, will be a synthesis of my work and the books that I have authored. The first book is Ka'aba, Building the Lighted Temple. This book is an African-centered paradigm teaching psychology, human development, character development, spirituality, and history. History that underpins our experience as diaspora and as African. This book also is the first degree program, which is a 9-month certification program that I teach in the Academy of Kinetic Education and Wellness. Second is my book, Secrets of Race and Consciousness. So I'll be emphasizing aspects of this book as well. And my third book, The Golden Sun Egg Uncracked. And my newest book, Ka'aba, The Great Pyramid, is the Tree of Life, Merkaba. In seeking the secrets and science of consciousness kinetically understood, we begin with these 5 primary questions. The first is, what may we be conscious of? The second is, who is doing the looking or having the awareness? The third is, how are we experiencing these states of consciousness? In other words, what is our apparatus? The fourth is, which state of consciousness of the 3 primary types, which I will talk about momentarily, are we primarily in? And fifthly, where are we today in the challenges in the human family as a planetary consciousness? And in my book, Seeking the Secrets of Race and Consciousness, I talk about this planetary consciousness as 3, 4, 5, after the golden triangle, also called ASACA, and that acronym stands for African, Semitic, Aryan Consciousness Admixture. So we'll really look at what is the consciousness admixture planetary-wide at this time. Our study in entering into this kinetic science brings us into the understanding of the Ka'aba or Merkaba, which is our luminous energy body of light. What is this luminous energy body of light? This luminous energy body of light is our vehicle of first eye spherical consciousness. It's our vehicle of rebirth. It's our vehicle of transformation, of resurrection, of ascension, transport, empowerment, enlightenment, initiation, and service. So in our study of consciousness, we come in rapport with understanding what is this vehicle that is us. And this vehicle that is us, that is bringing us into this dimensional shift in consciousness, is to learn the mechanics and the science of indwelling the Ka'aba, Merkaba, luminous energy body of light. In this study, we must come again in rapport with our divine trinity from the Nile Valley, from Kim, which our African ancestors called Osir, or Wasur, Haru, or Aset. Again, Aset, Haru, and Wasur. And these terms of this divine trinity coincide or correspond with the terms Ka'aba. In our study of the secrets and the science of consciousness, we first come into the ritual and the ceremony of the way of the heart. We first come into the judgment scene of the Hall of the Mentor that our African ancestors have given us. Our African ancestors were masters in the science of the soul, in the journey of the soul, and its transmigration of the soul. And key to understanding consciousness, our African ancestors gave us the judgment scene, where we see on the scale the weighing of the heart against the lightness of the feather of my heart. Our African ancestors have taught us that the heart is the seat of conscience and growing soul consciousness. And as we live our lives in accord with the laws of our heart is becoming as light as a feather. In other words, we are transmuting those matters, those substances, those often painful matters in our lives. And as we transmute those substances, we make our heart light as a feather in our heart. And here, pictured in this frame, you see the 42 laws listed. They are inclusive of all the ways that we attend to the kingdoms of nature, how we are stewards of the mineral kingdom and stewards of the vegetable kingdom, how we, as stewards of the vegetable kingdom, watch over the well-being of, instead of deforest, causing our forests to be decimated, we watch over our forests. We are stewards over the animal kingdom, and we are stewards over within the human kingdom and the kingdom of souls. So the 42 laws teach us how to be in accord with universal law, like I have not done inequity. I have not caused pain. I have not murdered. I have not mistreated children, and I have not mistreated animals. I have not polluted myself. So through our Kemetic practices, we are learning how to come in accord with the laws of my heart, so that when we come before the scales, our heart may be as light as a feather. In this next slide, we see after being found ma Peru and having had our heart found as light as a feather, it is the Haru within us, that aspect of our divine Trinity, that then brings us before the Lord of the world, or the Neb of the world, in this slide here, which is Wasur. So this Haru, which is the Karas within us, that is bringing us before the Lord of the world, that we may be found Ma Karu. And later in Christianity, the way that this would get recapitulated is the expression that no one can come before the Father except through the Son. But we can see in this slide that this conception predates Christianity, because it is the Haru, or also called the Karas within us, that brings us before the Lord of the world, the Son. But moreover, what we want to come in rapport with is the weighing of the heart is a daily practice where we make this recitation at the end of our day that we have been in accord with these 42 laws. And at the end of our lives, when we come before the scale, we want to have lived our life in balance and in harmony, so that our heart is found in as light as the feather of Ma'at. We as a planet and as a planetary consciousness, as a collective consciousness of humanity, we are now undergoing in this world period the way of the planetary heart of collective consciousness of humanity. The way of the planetary heart of collective humanity is likewise occurring at this time. In the judgment scene, the whole of humanity now enters within the holes of Mente on the inner realm. And as a collective humanity, we are now offering to the Neb, or the Lord of the world, our strides at just living and godly service on earth, or as our African ancestors have called, Gen. Together, as a collective humanity in consciousness, we constitute the body of Haru, also called the Karas. And it is in this mass formation now that we constitute the living nature as Osir. And one by one, as individual men and women are found na Koru, we join the ranks to form a collective critical mass which changes the whole of the planetary mind, which in consciousness. Standing before the Lord of the world, this inner group is at one with divine will, love, purpose, and plan. And we stand in the image and likeness of this living nature on earth as one humanity. This Lord of the world is known by many names: Osir, God, Allah, Jehovah, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And just as man and woman are working to bring personal will in accord with divine will on an individual level, so is collective humanity working to come into alignment with planetary will. And you see here in this slide, we see that our Earth pictured as this planetary happening is now occurring in consciousness. And if we dispel the word Earth, as I give these keys to dispelling words and symbols, is the word Earth. And you see, if you put the word Earth in a circle, you see it reveals the word hot. So we are talking about the hot, the of the im, kinetically understood. Now, this next slide shows us, though, that our symbols have been co-opted. And we see here Wasur and his symbols of power and his crowning, but we also see how our symbols have been co-opted by Christianity in this same dawning or adorning of these symbols. So I have been relentless in my work in tracing the symbols back to their source, back to their primary power, before they have become redispensed, recapitulated, distorted, and in many instances, despiritualized and made materialized. In order to move from the unmanifest to the manifest, we must understand the kinetic law of vibration. Our African ancestors gave us these key terms of Ka'ab and Ba, this metu-nature, which are keys to unlocking this creative process. Our African ancestors teach us that Ka is spirit. And just like the icons on your computer, if you click onto any one of these terms, Ka, Ab, and Ba, whole documents open up about the unfolding process of manifestation. So our African ancestors teach us that Ka is spirit, that all is spirit, and that Ka takes of the substance of itself to see itself in form. So if we begin with Ka as spirit, in understanding the law of vibration, we understand that Ka is spirit, and Ka is spirit, is matter at its lowest level of vibration, and that matter is spirit at its highest level of vibration. That all is spirit. Spirit, in taking of the substance of itself, can vibrate at its lower level as matter. And matter, in vibrating on a higher tone spiral, is spirit at a higher vibration. So our African ancestors teach that Ka, in this diagram here, the same slide, we have Ka in its double aspect as spirit, and Ka taking of the substance of itself to see itself in form, like you sitting in your chair there in the audience. And So there's this physicalizing aspect of Ka, where it takes of the substance of itself to see itself in form. Moreover, Ka, as spirit, takes of the substance of itself to have consciousness in form. So we see that here as the Ab, or the Ib, which we've already been talking a bit about. This Ka is as spirit taking of the substance of itself to see itself in form has its correspondence with Aset, the matter or physicalizing aspect of the divine Trinity. And Ka, as spirit taking of the substance of itself to have consciousness in form, is the Haru aspect of ourselves. This corresponds also with the Hat, as the Ka corresponds with the creative center. I'll show you a diagram a little bit later. Now, we have talked about how the Ab, is the seat of conscience and growing soul consciousness. And as that consciousness grows, as we become more conscious, that Ab becomes Ba, which our African ancestors understood as the soul. Later, Christianity would take a part of this and describe this as my Father and I are one, or my Father and I becoming one. But instead, hermetically understood, as we trace back to its primal meaning and source, we want to understand that it is, as Ab becomes Ba, we have Haru becoming as Aset and Asur. As Ab becomes the fullness of Ba in its consciousness, we have the uniting of Ka and Ba, of spirit and matter, of mother and father within us. So here we have the divine Trinity. As I've indicated, the Ka Ba corresponds with the divine Trinity of Aset, Haru, and Asur. And in this diagram, we see this Trinity laid out in the tree of life, and these three aspects of divinity, where we see in this Ka triangle, we see Aset, mother, spirit, matter. And we see in the Al triangle, Haru, which is son, daughter. And we see Asur Ba, father, in the Ba triangle as spirit, matter. So we see this divine Trinity, which is our temple, laid out linearly here. So what is the Genesis story, the story of creation? Because we're talking about seeking the secrets of conscience and consciousness, seeking the secrets and the science of consciousness. Well, our African ancestors were, as I said, masters in this science. And they weren't waiting for the big bang of science in this creation story. They had their own understanding of that creation story. In this Genesis story, we must at first come back to darkness, uppercase darkness or blackness, versus lowercase darkness, small d darkness. This lowercase darkness is some people fear darkness, but we would only fear lowercase darkness of our own making, which is a planetary darkness, which is the accumulation of wrong thought, word, and deed on our planet. We would not fear true darkness, capital D, true blackness, capital B, uppercase darkness and blackness that our African ancestors have taught us about. This darkness is also called the Aman, or the unmanifest, the unseen, the hidden. It is the fount of all possibility. It is the boundless, the eternal, all in all. It is without point and without circumference. It is limitless. It is access to all power and all potential. It is the source from which creation arises and to which creation returns. So our African ancestors call this the Aman, Ka, the Noon, the waters of space, the infinitude out of which creation arises. And in the Genesis story, our African ancestors understood in this blackness, one has to re-immerse themselves in this consciousness of blackness. I have a way of almost thinking about it in terms of this thick black oil where one is within and immersed within. And in that blackness and that darkness, in the creative process, we understand that there is a stirring within the waters of Noon. There is a stirring within the Aman. And in that stirring, there is the arising of the fire of Ra. The arising of the fire of Ra. In that blackness, in that stirring of the arising of the fire of Ra. Like striking the flint on a matchbox cover. We see this arising of this fire. And this fire is the birth of the children of Ra, who are Shu and Tefnut. And they are the centrifugal and the centrifugal forces in nature. And in their arising of the twin forces of Shu and Tefnut, they begin this circumgyration within the waters of Noon, within the Aman, within this blackness, this fire of rising and within the circumgyration. And this circumgyration raises a mound within the fires of, within the waters of Noon, whereby one flame then pierces that mound that has been raised, impregnating and fecundating, and there is this explosion now of light, which is called universe. This is humbly pictured here as we now see the arising out of this blackness, the cosmic egg, the universal egg coming into being, the world egg. We picture this humbly. And this cosmic egg is also the arising of the eye of Ra. On a cosmic level, we can think of the rising of the eye of Ra on a local level in our sky as we look out on a sunny day. But there is the arising of the eye of Ra cosmically understood as universe. And our African ancestors call this the universal Ba. They also gave us other symbolism to understand this process. In this slide here, we see the symbol of Khepera. And Khepera is this scarab beetle, which represents beginnings or coming into being. And this scarab beetle, what it does is it lays its eggs and then it rolls it into a doom ball. And you can see that ball here in this slide. And this ball really is a symbol for cosmos or universe in total, in that it contains all the to-be-birthed lives on that most grandest of cosmic levels, Khepera. So we have now the arising of the all-seeing eye upon the primordial waters of Noon. And we see how the unmanifest moves into the manifest, this universal Ra, this first arising of the eye of Ra. Now, who is doing the awareness? Who and what is looking and having the awareness? Who are those lives, those levels of consciousness? As we have Ba now as an identification of Ka, Ba is an encapsulation of spirit. Ba is an identification of Ka. We now see this identification. We have this beings that are ensouling at each level of this creative process. And so let's look at these eyes or these levels of awareness. Now in this scale here, we have the Assyrianization of consciousness. Now, our African ancestors teach us that Ka, Ab, and Ba are happening on every level. There is, in every aspect of creation, there is that which is Ka, Ab, and Ba in the tree, in the plant, within animals, within all aspects of nature. So let us start on a smaller scale and look at this process moving up the scale using the law of correspondence. The law of correspondence allows us to move the awareness from one level to have insight into the levels above. So if we look at the Ba as an identification of spirit, we can look at Ba Atom. We can look at the atom, the nature or the God in form that is ensouling the atom. We can move to the nature, God in form that is ensouling the tree. We can look at the nature, God in form that is ensouling an animal. We can look at the nature, God in form that is ensouling man and woman. We can look at the nature, God in form, Ba that is ensouling our planet and then our sun. We can look at the nature, Ba, God in form that is ensouling the constellation, like the constellation of Aries or the constellation of Pisces. We can look at Ba, nature, God in form that is ensouling the Milky Way galaxy. So we can look at super cosmic constellations, galaxies, and so on, up to including the nature, Ba, God in form that is ensouling the universe in total. There is that of form and consciousness and spirit ensouling at every level of creation. Let's look at a local level of consciousness and creation. What is happening on a local level? And let us turn now in this slide to Ba, man, God in form, man and woman in form, and Ba, God, or nature, that is planet, Earth in form. And this brings us to our apparatus, which is Kaaba, the Great Pyramid is the Tree of Life, Merkaba. So we begin to look at our Merkaba body of light, and which is the apparatus of consciousness. And how are we registering these states of consciousness? In order to register these states of consciousness, we must look at the apparatus, the equipment, the temple, the monument building. Our African ancestors were masters in building these monuments so that we could reflect the divine. And this is the monument that we are building. We are building in Kaaba, Merkaba, we are building this lighted temple. Now, we are all equal in essence. We are all Ka. Ka is spirit. But we are not all equal in consciousness. Meaning, we, like a radio, we have access to radio waves. If radio waves are like consciousness, we have access to it. However, we are not all the the same in our apparatus of radio, which some radios may have their dials turned this way, some radios may have their antennas turned that way. So we are equal in essence, but we are working on our equipment. And the apparatus that a human uses for its vehicle of consciousness is not the same apparatus as the tree is using. It's not the same apparatus as the planet Earth is using. It's not the same apparatus that the sun is using. So we want to look at the apparatus in building the lighted temple. In this next slide, Ka'aba, building the lighted temple, we begin by looking at our spiritual equipment, which is both human and divine. And this brings us into keys to understanding Ka'aba. The tree of life is the great pyramid, Merkaba. And we are understanding the triplicity that is the template of our own monument building, which is ourself, which is coinciding with the divine trinity within of Osir, etc. So we start in this next slide with a simple diagram of a house. You have a square frame, a triangle roof, and Ka'aba, the Great Pyramid, is this blueprint, this divine cosmogram or map for building this structure. And the divine trinity, we need a carpenter for this building. And who does Christianity say is the divine carpenter? Well, they might say Jesus. And what we say kinetically understood is it is Haru, and it is, or kinetically understood, it is the car rest within us. That is the divine builder of this temple. And so we have the divine trinity.
Come on!
Now,
Don't pass it, come! Don't pass it, come! I know. You're passing, I'm passing, come here, brother. Yeah. I'm passing. I can get half and half. I still always say that. Yes, sorry. That's all I want.
Not right in front of Queen.
All
Alright, okay, half to
I still won't listen, yes, all right.
half right, half Queen.
as king and queen. The second is Haru is the son or daughter, son daughter of Osir and Osset. And the third is that Osir is slain by his jealous brother Set. And fourthly, a fierce battle ensues between Haru and Set, in which Haru must avenge his father's death and be restored as the rightful heir to the throne. Now this symbolizes the reestablishing of the kingdom of earth within. So we see the components of this story and how this relates to our efforts at temple building. Now in this next slide, we are still with our basic house frame, the square in that first triangle, which constitutes as a word roof here. But in these first three levels, we have what can be considered the first floor, the second floor, the third floor. In this square or this quaternary, this building, this like temple. Now the first floor is our physical body. And in building the lighted temple, we are working to build that body and render it fit so that it has vitality and it serves in our work of as souls in this incarnation.
How much, right?
Now the physical body is made in terms of the law of vibration. The physical body is made of this more dense physical substance, this form, this physicalized substance. And you know that the physical body has a substance if you've gone to the gym and lift weights and you experience some soreness in that substance. Because that soreness will inform you on that physical level of the body and the work to be done to render that body fit so it's vital and serves in one color. of spirit. When we move to the next level, we are likewise working with a substance, but that substance is more subtle than the substance of the
Oh,
body.
he coming there.
And that substance brings us into the emotional body. And that, and we are working that emotional substance according to the law of vibration. Now, if I say to you, show me an emotion, how do you locate that? Like the physical body, how do you locate an emotion? But already you're moved to a level, another level of awareness when I say show me an emotion. But we can sense and see these emotions. For example, if you were outside of the room and I sent you a heartfelt smile, that energy would come forth in the ethers and you would be invited to come in. Similarly, if I shot you a look that could kill, that energy would come forth in the ethers, strike you in the chest, and you would tell that you would not want to come in. So we can see that even though this is an energy that's more subtle, a substance that's more subtle, we can sense and locate the substance of this second soul body, which is the emotional body, which has a name that our African ancestors have given it. Our African ancestors actually teach us there are 7 levels of consciousness. And so we speak about that. In this next level, we now move to the third floor, the third level, which is the mental body. And this substance of the mental body is even more refined, more subtle than the substance below. You'll know you are in that mental substance, even if you are having maybe difficulty in understanding some of these aspects of this presentation. Because when we work with that more subtle substance, we are working that very refined matter. We have to knead that matter like dough. So of the mental substance, you know, sometimes what we say is something is over our head. Oh, I can't understand this over my head. But, and sometimes we can be at very heavy or deep kinds of discussions and think, oh, I have a headache, or, but working this mental substance is something we must push through, just like we push through working with the physical substance in the gym. Just like we have to push through working with the emotional substance of fear or even love, work with those substances. So when we move to the mental body, we are needing that substance, that substance of the mental body, so it becomes light and it becomes, so it's malleable and becomes more and more light-filled and more receptive to the higher spiritual energies or soul bodies above that we can access in consciousness. This, and this essentially, these 3 levels are the 3 levels that traditional psychology stays on, very, not much going on these first 3 levels, which is essentially building the character building. And we want to build character, we want to build the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, but moreover, do we just want to have a building? Don't we want it to be light-filled? How do we have a light-filled vessel, a light-filled temple? That seeking of light brings us to the higher soul bodies, which our African ancestors teach us about. And that brings us to the next slide. because traditional psychology really deals with just 3 of the 7 soul bodies. So we have been talking in these
what you saying?
prior slide of character building. And you see when you dispel this word character, it reveals the words ka erector or ka ra actor. In kinetic language, K and C can be substituted. So we, in this character building, are really erecting ka, or erecting the spirit of within us. We are really the Ra, or the sun, the actor in this character building. In this next slide, we see how our African ancestors have taught us to unpack our whole spiritual equipment. And this slide here moves us into the higher Ab and Ba triangles. So at first we've been working within this Ka triangle, which really is the quaternary, or the building, or the fashioning of the temple, the squaring of the corners, the mastering of the physical, the emotional, and the mental soul bodies, the character development. But our African ancestors move us to unpack now the higher soul body of the Ab and Ba triangles. And in the Mecher, in the Curtin Rule, they teach us the naming of these soul bodies, which are called the Kab, Kakabit, the Sahu, the Ab, the Shechem, and Ba. So our African ancestors teach us how to indwell on all of these soul levels. So let's continue now that we've talked about the character building. When we're building character, you might equate this to your computer. When you're building the physical, the emotional, and the mental soul bodies, you are really fashioning the computer. But what is the software? And that's why we move into the Ab and the Ba triangle, to understand how to unlock the secrets and the science of consciousness within us. If we do not unlock the secrets of the science and the consciousness within us, and come to indwell these higher soul bodies within us, then we can be in a position where, as the masses, where others are utilizing our apparatus, our physical, emotional, and mental body, and we're running off of somebody else's software or soul program, coming into the unfoldment of our spiritual equipment and apparatus leads us and renders our capacity to operate on our own soul program. So let's now move to the Ab triangle. And in this slide, as we've already been talking about, the Ab triangle is the seat of conscience and growing soul consciousness. It is where we are creating spirit and harmonizing, trying to bring into accord these discordant energies of life and living. It is where we are making a choice to either work on our own personal will, or to come into alignment with divine will and purpose and plan for our lives. How to see more into the divine archetype of the universe and bring that divine architectural design into being. How do we glimpse within that divine architectural design and then build a world in accord with that, and build our temple in accord with that, and build our lives and our community in accord with that. Even the young people have said about this world that there's something whack about this world, and how do we build in alignment, in accord with the divine archetypal design? Well, we have to have the equipment that can at least glimpse into what that divine archetypal design might be. So like looking at the box cover of a multitudinous piece puzzle, there is a way to glimpse the box cover and then set ourselves in motion to build in accord with that. But if we have just dumped all the pieces out and we're trying to put things back together, but we don't make any reference to a divine archetypal plan and purpose and intent, then we are without spiritual guidance. We are without that inner guidance that can see and can know. And so that now brings us into the development of the first eye. This development speaks to the completing of our circuitry as Kabbalah. If we look at this next slide, we see pictured here the linear tree of life, and then we see pictured the bending back as we form the Merkaba body of light, vehicle light, like the nude poles, the bending back of the tree of life upon itself, like in a nude posture, or like the Sankofa symbol of bending back. And we see also the double Mirakut or pyramid, great pyramids, one above and one below, which form the Merkaba body of light. So it is in this development of the first eye that we are completing our circuitry and developing this spherical consciousness. And that is replicated in the very monument of ourselves as we move from a linear consciousness into this spherical consciousness, this spherical sightedness, like in the nude posture, like in the Sankofa symbol, the pyramid above and the pyramid below, in the Kaaba, the great pyramids, the tree of life, Merkaba symbol. So here we are now looking at this development of the first eye in this egoic spherical consciousness. And this egoic, don't get confused with Freudian terms. This is about Kemet and Kemetic science. We are becoming that egg in that egoic spherical consciousness. So I use this symbol. I'm very fond of using this symbol. One might say, well, why does Dr. Nateri have a disco ball? But this is a wonderful symbol of the first eye, because in this first eye, which we can locate here between our eyebrows, and we have that inner sightedness, that inner ability to see and know. However, it is not just this inner eye, but as we move into our body of light to involve the Merkaba light body, we actually become as this sphere, this spherical consciousness, where every aspect of our being is alive and sensing and knowing. So let's go into this. What is this ability to see the part and the whole and the relationship in between? Well, in this first eye consciousness, as we move from this linear sightedness into the spherical consciousness, we come to see within this individuated mirrored frame. And you can see this individuated mirrored frame right here. This is the ability to stand within this light, this eye, and see through that individuated mirrored frame. And then we have the capacity to see through this individuated mirrored frame. And we have the capacity to see the perspective and hold the perspective between in this individuated frame. and in this individuated frame. So as we step within this first eye, we are able to see this mirrored frame in relationship to this individuated mirrored frame, into relationship with this, and in relationship with this. We are able to see and know one at a time the part. We are able to see and know the relationship in between, and we are able to see and know all at onceness. So we are in this one at a timeness and simultaneous all at onceness. Different from the consciousness you see, let's say at the nightly news, where you have two people who come on and one is sharing a perspective here and the other sharing a perspective there, and they do this back and forth and they try to wear each other down in this very linear way. What we are working for in this spherical sightedness is to have this part, relationship, and simultaneous all at onceness in consciousness. So let's look at this more carefully. In this slide, we see the great egg of consciousness and these three primary states of consciousness, Kaaba. In other words, we understand, as our African ancestors have taught us, that the Ba comes forth upon earth to do the will of its Ka. Ka is spirit, taking of the substance of itself to have consciousness in form. And so when we look at this first, this Ba consciousness, we see that Ba consciousness is unitive. It's about synthesis, wholeness, interconnection. It affirms this is that. It affirms I know. It is spiritualizing. It is all at onceness. As we move into the Ab consciousness, we hold the ability to be dualative. And anytime we look at consciousness or energy, we can look at it at its highest term of spiral, in terms of its primal and optimal use, or at a lower term of spiral in terms of its more negative or weakness or debased condition. So when we look at Ab consciousness on a higher term of spiral, Ab consciousness is dualative, it's harmonizing, it's able to balance, it's able to relate and look at harmonizing these, what can be discordant energies and bringing them into harmony. It can be reconciliative, or in a lower spiral, it can be combative. It is about reconciling opposites. It's a consciousness that affirms this and or that. And the Ab consciousness affirms, I know that I know. The key words are soul rising and in-betweenness. When we look at Ka consciousness at a higher term of spiral is about the particulate, about the part, each individuated mirrored frame. But on a lower term of the spiral, Ka consciousness can become separative. Now, when we are within particulate consciousness on a higher term of spiral, this is the ability to see the part, to understand multiplicity, individualizing, analysis, division, diversity, discernment, discrimination of a higher term of the spiral. There is nothing wrong with being able to see the pot in all its beauty, like looking at a flower and beholding all its beauty, and then moving to look at all the beauty of another flower within the greater family of flowers. When Ka becomes, or this particular consciousness becomes separative, that is when we witness the part without the underlying unity, when we've lost the ability to hold the underlying unity. And so we then become immersed in this separative consciousness of this versus that. Ka is this materializing aspect. It's the ability to see this one at a timeness, and the ability also to see the all at onceness. Now, when we put this together, we have Ka'aba, which is infused, blended consciousness, a consciousness that affirms, I know the one in the many, I know the one in the same self in all the seeming self-appearances. And its key words are simultaneous, one at a timeness, in-betweenness, all at onceness. So how are we working for this unitive consciousness? What is required to have a unitive consciousness, a spherical consciousness? Well, this brings us to first look at what has been happening in this unfolding journey of consciousness in our world period. And that brings us to look and understand what time it is. Now, our African ancestors understood cycles of time. And our African ancestors lived in a cycle of time where there was a spiritualization of consciousness. Yes, our African ancestors lived in a time of greater spiritual energies and light on our planet and in our consciousness. And our African ancestors steadily watched that shade go down on our planet as we made our descent from that spiritual consciousness into this more dense materialization in consciousness. And the consciousness that now grips our planet is materialization in consciousness. You'll see in this diagram that we are, as a humanity, just in this vertex of the V, having consciousness, having made its deepest descent from the spiritualization into this materialization in consciousness. And now in this vertex of the V, we are just at this hatch mark as humanity is now making its hard, arduous uphill climb out of this materialization in consciousness into this re-spiritualization, into this evolutionary ascent in consciousness. We are now in the midst of those contending forces, both material and spiritual in the vertex of this V. And even though the death knell has been dealt to the materialization of consciousness, we are still in its grips. It is still a form that is in the process of shattering, but is still holding humanity. And the work now is of making the shift as the shade is now gradually going up on our planet. And our earth is being bathed with these spiritual energies of reascent. And we are the same ancestors that watched the shade go down as we made this planetary journey and from a time of greater light into this materialization of consciousness. And we are the same ancestors that are now watching the shade gradually go up and shards of spiritual energy bathing our consciousness now, so that we are making this resurrection and this reascension now into sacredness. You know, one of the stories that I like to talk about that really speak, I think, to our deepest descent, and I think is captured so well in our deepest descent, is the following, and that is the one that is described by Alex Haley in Roots as Kunta Kinte is making his journey here across in his ships of enslavement to the Americas. And Alex Haley describes how Kunta Kinte is chained and on his back, and how his muscles from the rocking of the ship of enslavement has abraded his muscles down to the bone so that his bone is exposed, and how he is surrounded and chained to other Africans, and the stench from this condition, where there are those who have died or in the process of dying around him. There are those who, right where they lay, are vomiting and urinating and defecating on themselves. This wretched condition of darkness that humanity had undergone. And there's a point where Alex Haley describes how Kunta, in the midst of this exhaustion, dozes off to sleep. And in that restless sleep, he has a terrible nightmare. A nightmare of just tremendous proportion, from which he awakes from with screams, only to realize that his nightmare or his reality had far exceeded in its wretchedness the nightmare that he had experienced. And that is just a caption of that vertex of the bee. How we, in that deepest descent, come to the place where our worst nightmare became our reality. Developing universal unitive consciousness. This brings me to talk about the secrets of race and consciousness in one of my books. And in the secrets of race and consciousness, I talk about which state of consciousness might we be in of the three primary types. As we looked at this cycle of time in moving from times on our planetary unfoldment and evolution of times more spiritual and times more material. And in my book, I talk about the 7 psycho-spiritual types in unfolding consciousness. And Secrets of Race and Consciousness is suggestive of developing a new typology of consciousness, which would examine the propensity for operating along particular lines or operating in a more blended consciousness admixture or blended consciousness admixture, which I call BKR, capacity. So how do we move into this blended consciousness admixture, given that we've gone from times spiritual to more material and are now moving back into the spiritual? In this next diagram, we see the 7 psycho-spiritual types in consciousness. And they are derived out of combining the 3 primary egoic states of consciousness. So we begin with the unitive, which we've talked about. And the unitive, again, is wholeness, synthesis, interconnection. I know this is that. Then which is type 3. Then dualative consciousness, which is harmonizing, reconciling opposites, balance. I know this and, or this and, or that, or this and that. And then the particulate or separative consciousness, which knows multiplicity, division, diversity, analysis. I think I know this, not that, or that, not this. So in this type, so one may be type 3, because remember I talked earlier about how we are moving now into this 3-4-5 triangle, the mathematical mathematics of this. How are we moving into this 3, 4, 5 triangle? So type 3 would be unitive, type 4 would be dualative, type 5 would be particular. So one's consciousness might primarily be unitive, type 3. One's consciousness might be primarily dualative, type 4, or one's consciousness might be primarily particular or separative or more materializing, type 5. Then when we look at combining those, this brings us into the total of the 7 different types, because we can have type 3, type 4, type 5, we can have type 3, 4, which would be a combination of 3 and 4, which would be a combination of unitive and dualative ability to see wholeness, but the dualative would bring in that reconciling, harmonizing aspect. Type 3 and 5 would bring in that unitive, but it would also bring in that particular. I mean, imagine a consciousness that would hold the unitive, where you can see more comprehensively in that aspects of the universe, and at the same time go into the particular, like the atom. Imagine that type of consciousness. Then you have type 4, 5, which would bring in the dualative and particulate, and then finally 3, 4, 5, which would bring in all 3 aspects. So what would the consciousness be that would bring in both, which would bring in all 3 aspects, unitive, dualative, particulate, 3, 4, 5? What would that look like? Where might we find an example of that in humanity? And where are the challenges today in the planetary consciousness of the unifield in terms of which consciousness humanity is most polarized in? We know that we are in a very materialized and very type 5 consciousness as we speak. But how do we move into that more unitive, dualative, and particulate, that 3, 4, 5? And let's look at an example of 3, 4, 5. When we look at the human family, what would be an example of a 3, 4, 5, that blended spherical consciousness of unitive, dualative, and particular? Well, when I think of an example in the human family, I think about Nelson Mandela. Why do I think about Nelson Mandela? Because Nelson Mandela was able to stand in that unitive consciousness. He was able to see and glimpse wholeness. And at the same time, he was able to stand in that particulate consciousness and see the part that Africans had played and the importance of that part. He was also able to stand in that dualative, which was that relating and reconciling and harmonizing and balancing and trying to work with all those discordant energies of the time, where he was trying to blend and balance that 3, 4, 5 in consciousness, that unitive, that dualative, and that particulate in consciousness. I see Nelson Mandela as someone in that spherical sidedness, in the ability to hold all of those elements together simultaneously, as someone who really spared humanity and our planet a bloodbath. Working with all of those human elements in consciousness. I see Dr. Martin Luther King in his work very similarly. And because of their work, we see an example of these 2 men, how they have brought a greater increase of light in the world because of the development of the first eye that was within them and that is within them. Now, but there's some confusion around Africans. Let's talk about the confusion among the African family. And I'll talk about some confusion in the European family as well. But there is some confusion in the African family about what it means to be unitive or what it means to be universal. You know, for some Africans, being universal and being unitive in consciousness means just let's love everybody, just let's love everybody. But they are confused about the metaphysics of what that takes. Because they'll say, I don't want to know about things African. I don't want to go back there. I don't want to learn about the part. They don't want to know about the part that we have played. And that is not a part that we look at divorced from the underlying unity of all of humanity, but we have contributed. And we must know and play and teach the part that we have played. We must know and teach the part that we have played. So as Africans, it is very important that we understand the importance of the part we have played in this world period. We must understand the part, the relationship between, and the underlying unity within the whole human family. So when we seek to be unitive and yet we forget the part that we have played, then we want to return to the feet of our mother, Africa, because this terrestrial journey that we have gone on as Africans who made their outgoing footsteps out of Africa 50, 60,000 years ago to populate the world is but a metaphor for the journey on a celestial realm as the celestial family. And when we return to the feet of our mother, we don't want to return empty-handed. We don't want to return not knowing the part we have played in this grand drama of the unfoldment of consciousness in humanity. And we don't want to return empty-handed without our family. We don't want to show up at the feet of our mother without our primary, our family with us. And what would that be like to return to the feet of the mother and we don't know the part we have played? We are not even showing up with an intact family. So we must do the work of understanding the part and the underlying unity. On the other hand, I think it can be said that this Aryan consciousness, this European consciousness, focuses extensively on the part and in a separative consciousness, in a very material consciousness, to the point where other parts are excluded, other parts are not seen as inclusive in the underlying unity of creation. And that is a consciousness that, well, if we can talk about consciousness corrections, there's a consciousness correction in both aspects, so that the 3, 4, 5 are unfolding, the unitive, the dualative, and the particular, that there may be more light on earth. And it is in this unitive consciousness where we have, in that bending back of the tree of life, as I talk about in my new book, in Makaba, the Great Pyramid is the tree of life, Kaaba. In that bending back, in that knitting of ourselves back together again, in this spherical first eye development, that we undergo the crowning and the seeding of ourselves as king, as Haru, upon his or her throne, as heir to Osir and Oset. Now, as Haru, who is us, as the Karas, you have united the seeming duality of Ka and Ba, of mother and father, of spirit and matter within the constitution, which is both human and divine. And this knitting or uniting of these dualities within is the crowning and the seating of Haru upon his or her throne as the son, S-U-N, and son, S-O-N, daughter that is within. We become this divine presence on earth. And this is not to be distorted as the material presence at Christmas or the so-called birth of the Son, S-O-N. So let's talk about these crowns and their uniting. The Pertin Root teaches us about the hymn of Osir in reference to these crowns in the book of Coming Forth by Day. And what we are taught is that the hymn says, "Glory be to Osir Nefer, Lord or Neb of the crowns of the north and the south, Lord of the lofty white crown, exalted being. Homage to thee, King of kings, Lord of lords, Prince of princes." So this uniting of the crowns, we learn in our history, it takes place in recorded time by the Nesubiti King Namur or Menes in around 31 BCE. And he is crowned king in the uniting of the north and the south of Kemet. So the very topography, the very geography of Kemet itself is a template itself in the uniting of the north and the south within us. The very land itself speaks to our building of our monument, our template, our divine science for this unification in consciousness. So as King Namur unites the north and the south of the landmass Kemet, which is really the landmass within us, he is donned with the red and the white crown of unification. And you see this picture here. We know this from the Namur tablet, where we see the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. However, our African symbols have been co-opted and despiritualized and materialized, because here we see the Kemetic, in this next slide, the Kemetic white and red crown of Kemet becoming the distorted Santa Claus hat at Christmas time. And we see here Pope Benedict XVI donning at some, quote, festive occasion at the Vatican, wearing this Santa-style hat called the Kamaru. And you see clearly here the distortion of our symbols of the red and the white crown by this Christian symbol. In this uniting of the north and the south, we have in the bending back of the tree of life, the knitting of ourselves back together, that we may indwell in our full spherical and egoic consciousness the Merkaba body of light. And in that bending back, in this next slide, we see that rising or resurrection of the sun daughter, the Karest, coming to the apex of the triangle. You see, as we do that bending back, we see now Haru, which is the heart within us, coming to the apex of the triangle. But moreover, we also see Osir and Osset, the king and queen within us, coming in secret embrace within the king and queen's chamber within. So the very monument building is within the very temple of the pyramid for our access and reclamation. We can see the way of knitting ourselves back together in the very monuments that our African ancestors gave us. This also brings us to Kemetically understand the tamarisk tree, or what is also the eureka tree. And we know from the story of Osir that, and you must come to the academy to study more the story of Osir, Osset and Haru, that when Osir was slain by his jealous brother Set, and he was placed in the sarcophagus and slain, his body and the sarcophagus were drifted to Byblos. And as that sarcophagus came to Byblos, this beautiful tamarisk tree or eureka tree grew around it. Now, the tamarisk tree is our evergreen tree, and there's so much symbolism to the evergreen and the eternal one, or the ever-coming one, or the everlasting life, and the renewal and the vitality of life that the evergreen tree symbolizes. And you see here in this slide, the Osir surrounded by the tamarisk tree. We must reclaim our symbols of resurrection. And so here in my books, Ka'aba, Building My Temple, long ago, I dispelled this word, the tamarisk tree. And you see the keys here for dispelling words and symbols. Again, the word tamarisk is put in a circle, and you can see that it reveals the word Christmas. We understand in the Kemetic language that K can be substituted for C, and right here we see how the very word tamarisk becomes the word Christmas and Christmas tree. So in order to give our children the primal meaning of Christmas in all of its spiritual implications, and to wrest it from this materialization that it has become, we must have celebrations that honor the tamarisk tree, Kemetically understood as the tree of resurrection. Now, that brings us to this next slide, where we see the tamarisk tree is the Djet pillow. It is the symbol of stability. And this Djet pillow or Tet pillow is the Karesmas tree, or the Christmas tree. It represents the 7 soul bodies given to us by our Kemetic science of psychology and spirituality. It's how to be Kemetically conscious and have a Kemetically conscious Karesmas. And so here in this next slide, we see the 7 soul bodies. And as we adorn and decorate this Karesmas tree, let us understand its Kemetic meaning as the Djet pillow, as the tamarisk, as the eureka, as the Karesmas tree, and that the spheres of light are really the Necharu. You see here in the slide, the Djet pillow on the left. And if you separate these columns in the Djet pillow, you can see that it becomes the Karesmas tree. And it becomes and reveals the 7 soul bodies. And at each of these stages in this unfoldment, we see the Necharu as adorning this symbol of life, the tree of life, the Christmas tree. And Haru, at the horizon, at the apex, becomes the star on this tree, or the one who has been found, Makaru, truer voice.
In water?
In the further co-opting of our symbols, we come to see here how the sledge, the discerning between the sledge and the sleigh, Kemetically understood.
Okay.
So pictured here, we see the ark of the goddess Sekur on its sledge. And this was the name given to the Sekur boat, or the Hindu. And when we dispel this word and look at this symbol, we can see that the Sekur boat would then become materialized into which is called the sledge, which then became materialized into the sleigh of Christmas. So how was the sledge used? Well, this sacred boat, which has profound meaning in the African spirituality, we learn from the Pernamu the following: that on the great day of the festival of Sekur, which was celebrated in many places throughout Kemet, the ceremony of placing the Sekur boat upon its sledge was performed at sunrise. So now we're talking about the rising of the sun.
I was on YouTube Live, that's why,